proving myself in my father's business, working long hours, handling the difficult clients, fixing the problems no one else could solve, all while waiting for the day he would finally acknowledge that I had earned my place. But as I sat at the Thanksgiving dinner table, listening to him make his grand announcement, I realized what I had always suspected deep down. He had never intended to hand the business to me, no matter how hard I worked. No matter how much I sacrificed, no matter how much more capable I was than my brother. Tom, my father, leaned back in his chair, swirling the last of his wine in his glass, his face glowing with satisfaction as he took in the room, fully aware that all eyes were on him. The fireplace crackled in the background, the scent of roasted turkey and cinnamon lingering in the air, the warmth of the holiday completely at odds with the icy pit forming in my stomach as I waited for the words I knew were coming. "Now that we're all here," he said, tapping his fork against the rim of his plate, "I think it's the perfect time to share some exciting family news." I watched as my mother, Linda, straightened in her chair, shooting me a quick glance, the kind that was meant to warn me to keep my mouth shut, to be gracious, to accept whatever was about to be said without making a scene. It was the same look she had given me my entire life whenever I dared to ask why my brother, Eric, got everything handed to him while I had to fight for scraps. Tom cleared his throat and smiled, the kind of self-satisfied grin that made my skin crawl, the same expression he wore when he made decisions that benefited him and expected everyone else to fall in line. "After a lot of careful thought, I've decided it's time to start stepping back from the business," he said, pausing just long enough for the room to fill with anticipation. "And I'm happy to announce that I'll be passing it down to Eric. He'll be taking over full operations starting next quarter." The words hit like a gut punch, but I didn't flinch, didn't let my expression change, didn't allow the fury clawing at my insides to rise to the surface. I felt David, my husband, shift slightly beside me, his hand brushing against my knee under the table, a silent reminder that he was there, that I wasn't alone in this, that I didn't need to react, not yet. Eric, sitting across from me, smirked as if he had just won a prize in a game he hadn't even played, lifting his beer in a mock toast, his voice dripping with false modesty. "I mean, I can't say I'm surprised," he said with a chuckle. "Dad always said it would go to the man of the family, and, well..." He gestured vaguely toward me, as if to say you were never an option to begin with. I could feel my mother watching me carefully, waiting for me to smile politely, to nod in agreement, to do what I had always done, accept my place as second, as less, as the one who would always have to work twice as hard just to be considered half as worthy. But this time, I didn't have to. David exhaled slowly, setting his fork down with deliberate ease, wiping his mouth with his napkin before turning his attention to my father, his expression unreadable, but the glint in his eye sharp enough to cut. "Funny," he said casually, tilting his head as if he was simply making an observation, "because we just bought out your biggest competitor." The room went silent. My father's smirk faltered, his brow furrowing slightly as if he hadn't heard correctly, as if the words didn't make sense in the context of the world he had built, a world where I was always in the background and Eric was always at the center. "What?" he said, his voice lower now, less sure, more cautious, as if he already knew, on some level, that whatever was coming next was something he wasn't going to like. I set my wine glass down carefully, my heartbeat steady now, my hands no longer shaking, my entire body filled with a calm, quiet satisfaction that had been building for months, just waiting for this exact moment. David turned to me, smiling slightly, as if to say, "Go ahead, tell them." So I did. "You heard him," I said, my voice steady, my gaze locked onto my father's. "David and I finalized the deal last week. We now own your biggest competitor." Eric laughed, the sound sharp and disbelieving, shaking his head as if he was certain this had to be some kind of joke. "No way," he scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "You expect us to believe that you, what? Pulled some money out of thin air and just bought an entire company? Come on, Rachel, don't be ridiculous." I didn't look at him. He wasn't the one I cared about. I watched my father, watched as the realization started to dawn on him, watched as his fingers tightened around the stem of his glass, watched as the understanding settled in that this wasn't a bluff, that this wasn't a joke. That I hadn't just moved on from the family business, I had positioned myself to beat it. "You really did it," he said finally, his voice quieter now, less confident, more unsettled. "You really went behind my back," and I cut him off before he could finish, my smile widening just slightly, feeling the years of dismissal, the years of being overlooked, the years of being told I wasn't the right kind of leader dissolve into something new. Something powerful. "Not behind your back, Dad," I said, lifting my glass again, meeting his gaze head-on, savoring the way his expression shifted from disbelief to something closer to fear. "Right in front of you. You just never bothered to see it." The silence that followed David's announcement wasn't just awkward. It was thick, heavy, and strangely beautiful, like the first deep breath you take after someone's had their hand on your throat for years. I had imagined this moment 1,000 different ways, but nothing had prepared me for the actual delight of watching my father's face slowly, unmistakably unravel as the words registered in his head. That smirk, the same one he'd worn for decades every time he talked over me, dismissed my work, or handed something to Eric I'd spent years trying to earn, faded slowly, like someone draining the color out of him one drop at a time. My mother, Linda, who had always played the soft-spoken accomplice in his campaign to keep me in my place, let out a small gasp as she clutched the edge of the table like it might slide out from under her. I turned just in time to catch her exchanging a wide-eyed look with Eric, who, bless his overconfident little heart, still didn't understand that the train he'd been riding his whole life had just slammed full speed into a wall. Eric gave one of those uncomfortable, half-choked laughs, the kind you hear when someone's trying to convince themselves that everything is still okay. "Come on," he said, looking at David like he'd just told the punchline of a bad joke. "You're not serious, right? You didn't actually buy Highland Industrial? That place is massive. You'd need, what, $10 million and a miracle just to get through their front door." David didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't even smirk. He just reached for his wine glass, took a calm sip, and set it back down as if he hadn't just dropped a nuclear bomb in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner. I leaned back in my chair, eyes on my brother, heart finally beating in a rhythm that didn't feel like submission. "No miracle needed," I said, my voice sharp and smooth like cold steel. "Just intelligence, patience, and a solid strategy. You know, the kind of things Dad never thought I had." Tom finally found his voice again, but it was quieter now, lacking that usual condescension he wrapped around every sentence like a bow. "You're bluffing," he said, but his tone gave him away. He didn't believe his own words. "Not really." I turned my body slightly toward him, keeping my face composed while fire simmered underneath my skin. 2 weeks ago, Highland's board started entertaining offers after their third-quarter losses. Their president had already floated the idea of selling the brand if the right offer came in. I got wind of it. David set up a meeting through a mutual contact. We made the deal in 6 days. Due diligence done. Contracts signed. Closed and sealed last Friday. Linda let out another soft gasp, this one edged with disbelief and something close to fear. Eric's smirk, which had been trying to stay alive by sheer muscle memory, finally gave up and slid off his face completely. Tom just sat there, staring at me like I had grown horns, like I was no longer the daughter he had ignored for so long but some new, dangerous creature he hadn't accounted for in his plans. "Wait," Eric said suddenly, voice louder now, brittle and cracking. That's not even possible. Why would they sell to you?" I leaned forward just slightly, enough for him to feel the heat in my words, but not enough to break the calm. "Because I showed up with the money. And because I wasn't tied to outdated notions about what kind of person should lead a business. And I don't know, maybe because I'm not the kind of guy who fumbles every opportunity that lands in his lap and still expects to be rewarded for it." Tom's jaw was set tight now, his shoulders stiff. "So what?" he snapped. "You think owning Highland means you've won something? My company's still ahead of them in market share." "For now," David replied before I could. His tone wasn't mocking. It was just a fact. "But Highland has deeper infrastructure, better suppliers, and a customer base that's been begging for better leadership. Rachel has already scheduled meetings with their regional managers and key clients. By Q2 next year, Your company won't just be behind, it'll be bleeding. I watched the color drain from my father's face like someone had pulled the plug. He looked older in that moment, more fragile, smaller. And I felt absolutely nothing for him. The rage I thought would bubble up in me never came. Because this wasn't about revenge for the past anymore, this was about power in the present. And for the first time in my life, it belonged to me. Across the table, Eric slammed his hands down, making the silverware jump. His face was red now, his voice nearly shouting. "What the hell did you just do?" I didn't answer right away. I wanted him to sit with the question, to feel it crawl under his skin and fester. Because it wasn't just a deal. It was a declaration. And we were just getting started. Eric's hands were still flat on the table, fingers splayed, his breathing shallow, his face burning red as he glared at me like I had just kicked over his carefully built tower of privilege and entitlement. The funny thing was, he had never actually built anything. He had just assumed that everything would be handed to him when the time was right, that the world would always make room for him the way our father had. But now, as he sat there blinking in shock, I could see the cracks forming in that delusion, tiny fractures in the confidence he had never really earned. I took my time, adjusting my napkin on my lap, tapping my fingers lightly against the rim of my untouched water glass, letting the weight of the silence stretch between us like a taut wire. I wanted him to feel it, to sit in it, to finally understand what it was like to be on the outside looking in. I had spent my whole life watching them make decisions without me, passing me over, pretending I didn't matter, acting as though I was just another employee instead of the daughter who had poured everything into the business they were so eager to keep away from me. I leaned forward slightly, my voice even, controlled, deliberate. "I've been watching Highland for years," I said, letting my words settle before continuing. "Watching their numbers, watching their growth, watching them adapt while you and Dad sat back and expected the market to stay the same just because it always worked for you before." Tom's eyes darkened, his lips pressing into a thin line, but he didn't interrupt. Maybe he thought I'd trip over my words if he let me keep talking. Maybe he thought I'd hesitate and give him an opening to regain control. He had no idea that I had planned this moment for years. "While you were coasting on reputation, Highland was pivoting," I continued, keeping my tone factual, detached, as if I was presenting quarterly results in a boardroom instead of dismantling my father's legacy at the Thanksgiving table. "They saw the market shifting before you did. They made smarter supply chain decisions. They invested in the right technology while you kept throwing money at outdated strategies because you were too stubborn to admit times were changing." Eric let out a sharp, bitter laugh, shaking his head, clinging to the last bits of false confidence he had left. "This is a joke," he said, but I could hear the strain beneath the words, the slight tremor in his voice that hadn't been there before. "You think you're just gonna waltz in and take over? That customers are going to just abandon us because you decided to play CEO for fun?" I tilted my head slightly, letting my lips curve into the smallest, coldest smile. "They won't have to abandon you," I said, pausing just long enough for the tension to stretch thin. "You'll run them off all on your own." Tom finally set his glass down, pushing his chair back just slightly, straightening his shoulders like he was preparing to finally step in, to put an end to all of this, to remind me, again, that this was his kingdom and I was nothing more than an intruder. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice low, almost controlled, but I could hear the anger bubbling just beneath the surface, pressing against his teeth like he was holding it back with sheer force. "I built that business from the ground up. I made it into something real, something lasting, something strong. I didn't blink. And now I'm going to tear it down," I said, my voice steady, calm, sharper than a knife but softer than a whisper. Linda gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, as if she had just realized for the first time that this wasn't a game, that this wasn't one of those fights where I'd get frustrated and storm off, only to come back later and pretend nothing had happened. "No, this was final." Eric scoffed again, but I could see the cracks deepening now, the quiet, creeping fear setting in as the reality of the situation started to weigh on him. "You don't even have experience running a company that size," he sneered, grasping for something, anything, that would make this less real. "You're going to run it into the ground in 6 months. David let out a quiet chuckle beside me, finally deciding to step in. "You really don't get it, do you?" he said, shaking his head as he swirled his wine in his glass. "You keep talking like Rachel is some outsider who doesn't understand business, but the truth is, she's been running your company for years. You just never noticed. Every major deal your dad closed in the last decade? Rachel laid the groundwork. Every crisis you narrowly avoided? Rachel handled it before it ever reached the boardroom. The only difference now is that she will finally be the one collecting the profit instead of watching you two take the credit." Tom's fists clenched on the table, his jaw tightening as his eyes flicked between David and me, the weight of everything crashing down on him all at once. The years of dismissing me, of underestimating me, of assuming I would always be there, waiting in the wings, hoping for a seat at a table that was never meant for me. His breathing was heavier now, his composure starting to fray at the edges. "You think you can just walk away from this family and ruin us?" I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, my smile unwavering. "I didn't walk away," I said softly, tilting my head just enough to let the words land exactly where they needed to. "You pushed me out." Tom's face darkened, but for the first time, it wasn't anger. It was fear. Because he finally understood, this wasn't his world anymore. It was mine. It started like a tremor, subtle at first, my father's nostrils flaring, his jaw tightening, that twitch in his right hand I'd seen 100 times before when something didn't go exactly the way he planned. Then the tremor cracked wide open, and he slammed his fist against the table so hard that silverware rattled and a spoon clattered to the floor. "You ungrateful little girl," he growled, his voice louder than I had ever heard it in public, sharp enough to make one of the younger cousins at the far end of the table flinch. "You have no idea what you've done. You've betrayed this family. You've betrayed me." I didn't flinch. I didn't even blink. I just looked at him, still seated, my hands folded neatly in my lap as though this was just another boring quarterly meeting and not the unraveling of a decades-old dynasty built on ego, entitlement, and silent resentment. "I didn't betray you," I said calmly, letting the words roll off my tongue like I had rehearsed them 1,000 times in front of a mirror. "You betrayed yourself the day you decided I was never going to be good enough simply because I wasn't born a man." Tom's face flushed red, the vein in his temple twitching in rhythm with his shallow, furious breaths, and I could see it, clear as day, the realization that this wasn't going to be one of those moments where he could just shout until everyone backed down. I wasn't 12 anymore. I wasn't the daughter who begged to be taken seriously. I was the woman who had quietly taken everything he undervalued and turned it into an empire of my own. Linda reached across the table, her voice a mix of concern and desperation, trying to smooth it all over with the same soft-spoken platitudes she had used my whole life whenever things got tense between us. "Honey," she said, placing her hand over mine like it still meant something, "let's not turn this into a fight. We're family. We've always said family comes before business." The thing is, that phrase used to work on me. It used to cut right through my defenses and guilt me back into line, reminding me of every Sunday dinner I showed up to even when I didn't want to, every birthday card I signed for people who wouldn't have remembered mine, every time I swallowed my opinions just to keep the peace. But tonight, those words had no weight. They were hollow. I looked at her hand resting on mine, then slowly pulled my hand away, not violently, but deliberately. "No, Mom. You always said family comes before business. But only when it served his business. Or Eric's. Never mine." Eric, still pale and clearly rattled, straightened in his seat like he was trying to regain some sense of control. "Okay, let's be real here," he said, motioning between us like some half-baked referee. "This isn't good for anyone. I mean, Highland was always second to us anyway. If you're in charge now, fine, whatever. Just don't tank Dad's company out of spite. You can help keep it afloat, right? You're good at that stuff." There it was. The audacity. The nerve. The ridiculous, familiar assumption that no matter what, I'd still be there to fix their messes. That even now, after everything, I owed them something. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my dress, looking directly at my brother, this man who had done less than the bare minimum his entire adult life and somehow still thought he could bark out orders like I was his personal assistant. No, I said flatly. I'm not going to help. I've been doing that in secret for years. Fixing things in the background. Carrying the weight you all pretended didn't exist. I've cleaned up your screw-ups, salvaged deals you almost lost, and made connections that you wouldn't have had access to if I hadn't put your names on things I built. But I'm not doing it anymore. Eric opened his mouth, but I raised my hand before he could get a single word out. Don't, I said, low and firm. Don't you dare ask me for anything else. I don't owe you. I don't owe him. And I sure as hell don't owe this family another second of my life. The room was dead silent now. The rest of the family, cousins, aunts, uncles, all of them who'd been sitting quietly through the fireworks, were now frozen, mouths slightly open, forks midway to mouths, no one daring to move or speak. Because even they knew something had shifted. Tom stood slowly, as if he still had one last card to play, one final move to make. His voice dropped lower, but it didn't lose its bitterness. So you're just going to walk away? After everything we've given you? I looked at him, really looked at him, this man who had once seemed so much larger than life, the center of our family, the name on the building, the voice in every room. But now he looked smaller, hunched, and not because of age or illness, because the illusion of control had finally been shattered. What you gave me, I said, meeting his eyes with the same steel he used to break me down as a kid, was a front-row seat to what I never want to become. And I am so done pretending I'm thankful for it. I reached down, picked up my napkin, folded it carefully, and placed it on my plate with a quiet precision that somehow hit harder than anything I'd said aloud. I turned to the rest of the room, my chin high, my voice just loud enough to fill the space. I have one final thing to say before I go. I stood there, every eye in the room locked on me, and I could feel the tension twisting tighter with every passing second. It felt like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I'd say next. And honestly, I think part of them expected me to soften, to backpedal, to fall into the same old rhythm, say something nice, smooth over the cracks, pretend this whole blow-up was just a bad holiday moment we'd all laugh about in a few years. But that version of me was gone, buried under years of disappointment, suffocated by every unspoken word I'd swallowed at this very same table. I glanced around at the faces I'd grown up with, faces that had watched me work harder than anyone else in the room, but had always looked right through me when it mattered. My voice didn't tremble when I spoke, not this time, not now. I spent my whole life waiting for someone at this table to tell me I mattered, I said, the words cutting clean, but not cruel. I waited for my dad to say he was proud. I waited for my mom to stop brushing things under the rug. I waited for my brother to realize that respect isn't given out with your birth certificate, it's something you earn. And now? I realize I was waiting for something I never actually needed. Eric let out a breath like he was gearing up to say something, some half-baked jab or excuse, but I didn't give him the chance. I turned to him, locking eyes with the man who'd coasted his whole life and thought himself clever for doing so. You're about to find out what it really means to earn something, Eric, I said, voice like steel under velvet. You're going to wake up one day and realize the business you thought would carry you for the rest of your life doesn't give a damn about your last name. It's going to eat you alive if you don't learn how to work, really work, for the first time in your life. He shifted in his seat, not saying a word, not even trying to look tough anymore. He just looked small, deflated. Like the mirror he'd been avoiding had finally been shoved in his face, and for the first time, he couldn't pretend he liked the reflection. Tom's silence was louder than any shouting match we'd ever had. He just sat there, hands in his lap, eyes fixed on his plate like maybe if he didn't look at me, none of this would be real. But it was. Every word, every second, every breath was real, and there was no going back. Linda blinked rapidly, lips parted as if on the edge of a plea, but no sound came out. Maybe she wanted to say she was sorry. Maybe she wanted to tell me to stop, to be kind, to remember that family is family. But whatever words she had left weren't strong enough to hold up the crumbling mess in front of her. I looked between the two of them and shook my head. You never lost me tonight, I said quietly, letting the truth settle into their bones. You lost me a long time ago. You just didn't notice because I kept showing up. I kept trying. I kept hoping you'd see me for who I am, not who you decided I should be. But I'm done begging for a seat at a table I've outgrown. David stood when I did, offering his hand in that quiet, steady way he always did when the world tried to pull me under. And as I laced my fingers with his and looked around the room one last time, I felt it, not anger, not victory, but peace. The kind of peace that comes when you finally choose yourself after a lifetime of being the afterthought in someone else's story. We walked to the door slowly, the sounds of clinking silverware and low murmurs replaced by dead silence. No one stopped us. No one stood. No one tried to change my mind. Because they knew. They knew the Rachel who used to sit quietly and take it had walked out the door with me years ago. It just took tonight for the rest of them to realize it. As we stepped outside into the cool night air, I took a deep breath, letting it fill every part of me that had once ached to be seen. I pulled out my phone, opened my contacts, and without hesitation, removed my father's company from the list. No more late-night calls fixing deals that weren't mine. No more pretending to care about problems I had no hand in creating. Then I blocked their numbers, my father's, my brother's, even my mother's, because I knew exactly what would come next. Guilt. Panic. More hollow apologies and half-hearted justifications. And I didn't want to hear a single word of it. David looked over at me, smiling in that way he always did when he knew I had just stepped into my power a little more. "You okay?" he asked, not because he doubted me, but because he always made space for me to feel. I nodded, slipping my phone into my purse. "I'm better than okay," I said, meaning every word. "I'm finally free." And as we walked toward our car, the sound of gravel crunching under our shoes, I didn't look back. Not once. Because some chapters aren't meant to be revisited. They're meant to be closed decisively, permanently, and left behind for good. That dinner wasn't just a holiday gathering. It was the last supper for the version of me that spent her life waiting for permission. From here on out, I write the rules.